As the 1950s began, it became really clear that this was a new world. Early on in the decade, there was an extraordinary housing boom in the United States, as the young men who had been off in war would come back and begin having families. The first modern credit card was introduced in 1950, and the consumer was truly unleashed. North Korea would invade South Korea that year, and President Truman would commit troops without the authorization of Congress. The big geopolitical fear had turned to the Soviet Union, and internally, to communist agitators and saboteurs. The McCarran Internal Security Act would be passed in 1950, requiring communist groups to register with the government. Public investment in the stock market would expand rapidly, as normal people, now with more savings, would be able to invest. In 1951, AT&T would become the first American company to have over 1 million shareholders. That same year, President Truman would speak in the first coast-to-coast TV broadcast, as the power of radio was giving way to the television. There's something really unique about this communication method that wasn't present in earlier ones. There had always been a degree of decentralization with communication technologies in the past. Take the printing press. That led to the world of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War. Yet the television was extremely centralized, far more so than radio, which did have decentralized use. If you wanted to build a perfectly ordered society where a ruling faction could have everyone believe the same thing all at once, well then the TV was the perfect technology for that. Everyone in America would all put on the news at night, and all hear the exact same story of events. So consider that degree of centralization when we think about the atmosphere of the following decades. Dwight Eisenhower would be elected in 1952 as Supreme Allied Commander in the Second World War. He was the man who won us the war. I like Ike. That's all the slogan he needed. That same year, the first hydrogen bomb would be detonated as the United States would begin ramping up its nuclear arsenal rapidly. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were becoming dire. It was perfectly clear that this was the one geopolitical project of the United States: oppose the Soviets. By 1953, an armistice would be signed in Korea, and the foreign policy goal would shift to trying to keep as many countries as possible from succumbing to communism. Unfortunately for that goal, French forces would be defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, effectively ending French colonial rule. But I'm sure nothing will come of that. On May 17th of 1954, the Supreme Court would hear Brown v. Board of Education, ending racial segregation in public schools. Very often people associate the 1960s with efforts like this, with figures like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But really, most of their core efforts and most of the politics occurred in the 40s and 50s. The 60s was more of a cultural push, and to a certain extent a victory lap. In 1957, the 57 Civil Rights Act would pass, and that same year, President Eisenhower would use federal troops to ensure the integration of a public school in Little Rock, Arkansas. After the re-election of Eisenhower in 1956, the Middle East would begin becoming more of a concern. The Eisenhower Doctrine would establish aid to Middle Eastern countries. The concern was that countries in the Middle East may begin looking favorably toward the Soviet Union, particularly those in poor economic circumstances. Thus, it was thought that if the United States gave direct aid to countries, then they would align with the American sphere, and not with the Soviets. But right in America's backyard, in 1959, Castro's communist revolution would win in Cuba. These years were consumerist. They were plentiful. By 1959, consumer credit had reached $47.2 billion in total, which is an utterly rapid explosion of credit. Houses were cheap and affordable. There were many young families, with young children growing up in nice neighborhoods. These were the glorious honeymoon years of the liberal economic order, when it seemed like the wealth would last forever. Everything was sort of innocent. Much of society began to become geared around teenagers in these years, as even the kids had disposable income. The culture of driving around in cars, young couples going out to movies, or up to that spot in the hill everyone goes to. You know, the foundations of modern teenager-y things, all really stemmed from this era. Back in Britain, Winston Churchill had intended for his coalition government to remain in place until the defeat of the Japanese Empire, yet Labour would not accept this. He would resign in 1945, with Clement Attlee becoming the next Prime Minister. Attlee's government was in a difficult spot following the war. They retained many of their welfare state policies and attempted a large government approach, trying to alleviate the extreme poverty that the war had wrought. While this would work to some extent, the United Kingdom's economy was doing very poorly. There was a sort of general malaise in those years, but still, the country would attempt to rebuild. By 1951, Winston Churchill would come back as Prime Minister, beginning 13 years of conservative rule. This post-war period has become remembered as the Consensus Years, a period of nationalization of industry, of strong unions, of heavy regulation, high taxes, and a thorough, all-encompassing welfare state that took care of Britons from cradle to grave. In many ways, this consensus was just people happy to not be in a war anymore. There wasn't much growth, there wasn't much to look forward to, but it wasn't bad anymore. So they'd just trudge on forward in this morass of mediocrity. Consensus. In 1952, King George would die, leaving the throne to his daughter, Elizabeth II. Her ascension gave a sense of hope, optimism, seeing a new, young queen, after a period of such destruction, at least in symbolic terms, was the ushering in of a new age. There was also a widespread sense that the continuity of the crown indicated stability in an unstable Britain. This is a very interesting social factor that would play a subtle but very significant role throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Britain, in many ways, was less resistant to many social and political changes than other countries. The traditional nobility willingly giving up quite a lot of what they had had. Traditionalists and conservatives accepting defeats without so much as a whimper. And partially, this can be attributed to the continuity of monarchy. They would look to the crown and say, well, this is the same, so I guess we aren't really changing all that much. But they were. This is a very subtle, yet very significant psychological factor that has played a truly outsized role in British politics since then. Facing poor health, Winston Churchill would resign in 1955, being replaced by Anthony Eden. The next 2 years may be some of the most symbolically heavy years that the British Empire would ever experience. The 1956 Suez Crisis would indicate for all the world to see that the United States was the world hegemon, and no longer Britain. The Suez Canal had been, for a very long time, of vital strategic importance to the British Empire. That shipping lane was so substantial that if anything were to happen to it, well, I don't know what they'd do. In July of 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser would lead a military coup to overthrow the Egyptian monarchy. It would work. Taking over as Egypt's leader, he would seek to assert Egyptian sovereignty. He wants British troops out of his land. In 1954, Britain would agree to withdraw its remaining troops from the Suez Canal zone by June of 1956. Yet over the following years, Egypt would appear to be drawing closer to the Soviets, particularly after a September 1955 deal, where they announced an arms deal that they had made with Czechoslovakia. By 1956, the United States and United Kingdom have reached an extreme level of concern over their Soviet friendliness. They had previously made offers to finance the construction of the Aswan Dam, a very important Egyptian infrastructure project. Yet in light of new circumstances, they withdrew that offer. On July 26th, Nasser would announce that Egypt would nationalize the canal, using revenues from the canal to fund the dam. 2 days later, Britain would freeze Egypt's assets, and in August, Britain would begin mobilizing its forces. Throughout the months of August and September, the United States, United Kingdom, and France would be joined by other nations in the creation of the Suez Canal Users Association. They attempt to negotiate with the Egyptians, but Nasser will not back down. He intends to take the canal for Egypt. On October 14th, 1956, Britain, France, and Israel would hold secret meetings in France. They devised a secret military operation to get the canal back, and on the 29th, Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula, beginning an advance toward the canal. Great Britain and France are shocked shocked and appalled. They had no idea that Israel would do such a thing. How could they do such a thing? Thus, they issue an ultimatum to Egypt and Israel to withdraw their forces from 10 miles of the canal. While devising this plan, they had anticipated that Egypt would reject their ultimatum, and Egypt does. With the plan going just swimmingly, Britain and France begin airstrikes on Egyptian airfields. Beginning November 5th, British and French paratroopers begin landing in ports at the northern end of the canal. The Soviets would immediately condemn this action, making threats that sound a lot like they're going to nuke Britain and France. Very shortly thereafter, President Eisenhower would condemn Britain and France and threaten the sale of US bonds, which would collapse the British pound. One day later, caving to international pressure, the United Kingdom and France would agree to a ceasefire. This is so substantial because France, and especially Britain, had been dominating the planet for the past century. They were used to being able to go around the world and project force, but now the United States comes along and just says, no, and that's it. They can't do it. As a result of this, Prime Minister Eden would resign. The British, French, and Israeli militaries would all withdraw. This is also very interesting, because a major reason why so many in Britain backed the creation of the Israeli state was precisely to use them for things like this, and it failed. Leaving aside the Jewish and Protestant Zionists, there was a sizable faction that believed that the Israeli state would allow them to project power into the region, and it just ended with America saying nope. Well, that's the end of an era. Only 1 year after this crisis had erupted, in 1957, Ghana would become the first sub-Saharan colony to become independent from Britain. Their empire was already in ruins, and now it was even more ruined. Despite this, Britain would certainly not be without its ability to project its foreign policy aims, not merely by acting through the United States, but on their own. They had developed a very robust intelligence service. In 1909, Britain would establish the Secret Service Bureau. This agency would be comprised of two sections: the Home Section, responsible for counter-espionage, and the Foreign Section, responsible for intelligence gathering. During the First World War, the Foreign Section's activities would expand greatly. It would develop vast intelligence gathering networks in Germany, something that came to be seen as vital for the war effort. In 1920, it would officially adopt the name the Secret Intelligence Service. The Home Section would become known as MI5 and the Foreign as MI6. Throughout the Second World War, it would become an enormous and powerful institution, responsible for a substantial amount of Allied intelligence gathering during the war. It would go from a small operation to one of the most powerful institutions in the world. Why is it so powerful? Well, when you're able to get that much information, there's a whole lot that you can do. The United States had had very fragmented intelligence operations prior to the Second World War. Each branch of the military would have its own intelligence. There would be other agencies beyond that, and they wouldn't always cooperate very well. This led to a very chaotic, disorganized system that wasn't conducive to winning the Second World War. Realizing that just such a thing might happen, in 1940, Roosevelt would create the Coordinator of Information Agency. Its role was to coordinate between all those different intelligence services, not centralizing them, but at least organizing them. In 1942, it would be reorganized as the Office of Strategic Services, quickly becoming a globe-spanning multi-tactical operation. It would use sabotage, espionage, psychological operations, intelligence analysis, pretty much any tactic that one could think of, it would use. However, after the war, wanting to get off of the war footing and return to peacetime civil structures, President Truman would issue Executive Order 9621, abolishing the OSS. Its research and analysis arm would go to the State Department, and intelligence and counterintelligence to the War Department. Yet, quickly, the government began to feel that they may have scrapped too much, and so on January 22nd, 1946, Truman would direct the establishment of the National Intelligence Authority and the Central Intelligence Group. The NIA, they would develop and coordinate intelligence activities, while the CIG would act like a proto-CIA, very similar to what the CIA would become, but it was a little weaker and couldn't quite do as many things. Over the course of the next few years, there would be fierce debate about exactly what their intelligence apparatus should be. Some wanted a stronger intelligence agency, some were fearful of what it could become, and some, like J. Edgar Hoover, didn't want to give up his share of the spying and having control over people. Yet, on July 26, 1947, Truman would enact the National Security Act, creating a unified Department of Defense, creating a National Security Council, and creating the CIA. And throughout the 1950s, the CIA would get to work. In 1953, it would conduct Operation Ajax, overthrowing Iran's prime minister via propaganda, bribery, cooking up artificial street protests, creating fake political movements, what we'd expect, ultimately leading to the installing of the Shah of Iran. In 1954, they would orchestrate a coup in Guatemala. This one was similar, but also involved the training of paramilitary forces and convincing Guatemala's leader that a large-scale invasion was imminent, thus saving the United Fruit Company. That same year, they would begin psychological experiments, which spanned multiple programs, but very famously was the start of Project MK-Ultra. They would launch an insurrection in Tibet in 1956, and throughout the decade, and future decades, would begin a very long campaign of introducing propaganda into the Soviet Union. They hit the ground running and became really powerful, which, having that level of ability to, with impunity, manipulate the politics of anywhere in the world, including assassinations, would make them enormously powerful, because that's exactly who you would be afraid of if you were a politician. MI6 would get its fair share of work too. Operation Jungle would see agents and trained foreign assets infiltrate the Baltic states, as well as Poland, in an effort to conduct anti-Soviet operations. MI6 and CIA would work together in an effort to destabilize and overthrow the Albanian government. MI6 would as well be a part of the Iranian operation, overthrowing their prime minister and installing the Shah. Beginning in 1956, and taking over a year to complete, MI6 and the CIA would again work together to build a tunnel under Berlin to tap into Soviet communications. These two agencies, by the 1950s, had become a power faction all their own. It's great to be the king, but if you're in charge of the king's guard, well, that's a special type of power, and all from the shadows. Who owns your house? You, or the guy who's in charge of all your guards? Who really has power? The guy in the big office? Or the man who knows all the secrets? So, at this point, we need to put intelligence agencies up on the board as another substantial power faction that needs to be considered. Look, I'm not saying the CIA's in the walls, but I also don't think it's that revolutionary to say that intelligence agencies have a lot of power and influence, and if you're trying to analyze the politics of a nation, they have to be considered. We often think of the 50s and 60s as having very different characteristics. And while that's certainly true, the idea of the change being gradual isn't quite true either. The change between those two worlds was really sort of odd. In some ways it was sudden, but in others it was just a logical continuation. In 1960, the FDA would approve the first birth control drug on the market, which might have had the most significant social impact of any invention that century, changing the mating behavior of species. We can't even begin to figure out what that did. 1960 would see the campaigns of John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Nixon was born in January 1913 to Frank and Anna Nixon, a modest Quaker family in California. He would go to school at Whittier College, where he was excellent at debate and football, later graduating at the top of his class in Duke Law, becoming a lawyer in California. Fairly early into his career, he would marry Pat Ryan, before going off to the Second World War, where he would rise to the rank of lieutenant commander in the Navy. Shortly after his return, he would run for the House of Representatives, winning a seat for California's 12th District, successfully attacking the incumbent candidate by accusing him of communist sympathies. In the House, he would be heavily involved in the House Un-American Activities Committee, particularly in the investigation of Alger Hiss. In 1950, he would be elected to the Senate, and 2 years later become running mate to Dwight Eisenhower. He was a loyal and dutiful vice president. becoming heavily involved in foreign policy and diplomacy, including debating Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev directly while in Moscow. He was one of the most resolute anti-communist figures in the United States. John F. Kennedy was born in May of 1917 to Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Kennedy. The family he was born into was very wealthy and well integrated into the society of America's traditional upper class, even though their money was newer than most of the members. They were related to prominent American families. They would be related to notable British families as well, most notably the Cavendish family, who included the Marquess of Hartington. However, something peculiar about the family is that they were Catholics. Most of America's upper class were Protestants. Throughout his childhood, he would attend elite private schools, and he would go on to Harvard, although he would be plagued by chronic health problems, and particularly severe problems in his back. He would graduate in 1940, and ultimately go to fight in the Second World War, commissioning in the Navy. While aboard a PT boat in the Pacific, he would successfully lead his men to safety, after being hit by a Japanese destroyer. This would earn him much fame and accolade, as the story would be heavily publicized, building an excellent public image for him. Yet, in August of 1944, his older brother would be killed in a bombing mission over Europe. His family had always intended for his brother to become a political figure. Their family had succeeded in wealth, and were socially well integrated into the old upper class, but they wanted political prowess. They didn't want to just be close to politics. They wanted a family member in a big chair, and that was supposed to be Joseph. But after his death, that responsibility fell on John. After briefly working as a journalist for a couple years, he would become a representative for Massachusetts' 11th District. It was primarily a working-class district, where he would be very receptive and attentive to the working-class needs of his constituents. In 1952, he would enter the Senate, and 1 year later, he would marry Jacqueline Lee Bouvier, also from a very well-integrated wealthy family, and notably, also Catholic. At some point in the late 1950s, he would begin planning to run for president, and in 1960, he would win, defeating Richard Nixon. After years of being dominated by this new Anglo-American liberal world order that had come out of the machine of Franklin Roosevelt and out of Britain, Kennedy was to a large extent a return of the old upper class. He may not have perfectly been the old money of the United States, but he was much closer, a bit like in Britain when someone favorable to the old nobility would gain power. He had friends across the Democratic Party, but he wasn't of that order. Those think tanks, those interest groups, and notably, the intelligence agencies. In 1961, the United States would attempt a military landing in Cuba to support Cuban militant factions opposed to the communist government. The operation would be an unmitigated disaster. As a response, Kennedy would begin to become increasingly antagonistic toward the intelligence agencies. A year later, Soviet missiles would be placed in Cuba. Kennedy would exercise great restraint and show great diplomatic capability. He would secretly negotiate with Nikita Khrushchev, agreeing not to invade Cuba if they would remove their missiles, and secretly making an agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. It was an example of world leaders keeping level heads and coming to a resolution, in a time when people around them would either become panicked or would demand a violent solution. He would calmly work it out. That year would also be a major year for various social movements. The civil rights movement would be in full force. A new feminist movement would burst forth, as feminist writer Betty Friedan would publish The Feminine Mystique, and black student James Meredith's enrollment in the University of Mississippi would cause widespread controversy and increased fervor in the civil rights groups. The following year, in 1963, these trends would all accelerate rapidly. Martin Luther King would give his most famous speech to an enormous crowd assembled in Washington, D.C. The United States and the Soviet Union would establish a DC-Moscow hotline to be able to deal with situations like the missile crisis in the future. And Kennedy would begin to become more and more opposed to the intelligence agencies. He would oppose many of the entities that had made their way into the US government and into the power structure. He was increasingly reflecting the old ruling class of America, before London's Anglo-American liberal world order, before the vast intelligence agencies, and before Roosevelt's reordering. In many ways, he was a return to what the United States was, just as much as he was an image of youthful optimism. And now, he hated the CIA, and the CIA hated him. But unfortunately, some guy killed him. I don't know what that's about, because he himself was killed by a club owner involved with the Jewish mafia, who just didn't want John's wife to go through the hardship of being part of a trial like that. This man was Jack Ruby, and when a CIA doctor involved in psychological experiments would go to visit him, he would go insane himself. Then he died too. So I suppose we'll never really find out what happened. It sure is a shame that guy just decided to kill President Kennedy. But anyway, Lyndon Johnson would become the president next. He was born in a farmhouse in a poor part of Texas in August 1908 to Samuel Ely Johnson and Rebecca Baines. He had a very poor upbringing in this rural part of Texas. He would go to Southwest Texas State Teachers College and begin teaching at a school for Mexican children in Texas. After that, he would move to Washington, D.C. to become an aide to Representative Richard Clayburgh. 4 years later, he would marry Lady Bird. Franklin Roosevelt would appoint him the director of the National Youth Administration. Roosevelt seemed to like him quite a bit. During the war, he would fight in the Navy. Afterward, running for Senate. During the primary, he would win by a very thin 87 votes, which many suspected was fraudulent, and there's a whole lot of reason to suspect it was fraudulent. He would become Senate Majority Leader in 1955. In 1960, then candidate Kennedy would ask him to be his running mate. They hadn't particularly got along, nor did they see eye to eye, but Kennedy needed somebody to balance the ticket, someone to get votes in the South, and Johnson was ideal for that. He had the backing of Southern Democrats and the New Deal coalition, as well as strong union funding. Now in the Oval Office, Lyndon Johnson would sign the Civil Rights Act in 1964. That same year, U.S. Navy vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin would be attacked in a brutal and unprovoked, absolutely heinous and inconceivable attack by the Vietnamese communists that we documented very well. Congress would pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, empowering Johnson with wide unilateral force in Vietnam, and Johnson simply had to do it. He would never have wanted this to have happened, but if it weren't for that irrefutably true attack that happened for absolutely no reason in the Gulf of Tonkin, then we would have just let the North Vietnamese go along their way. But unfortunately, Johnson had to be strong. He had to go to Vietnam, which the CIA had been in for a while now. That same year, Johnson would propose his idea of the Great Society, which was a large welfare state. Johnson wasn't exactly a progressivist, but in many ways he was resurrecting some of those ideas, almost like a very watered-down version of the British cradle-to-grave notion. The following year, he would sign the Medicaid and Medicare bills into law, creating the programs. Spending would increase for welfare, education, and healthcare, and all the while, the social situation would get much more dire. Racial conflict was becoming severe. Malcolm X would be killed that year, and the Watts riots would take place. Unrest was growing. The next year, the Black Panther Party would be started, and as a result of the war and welfare spending, inflation would become a real problem. The United Farm Workers, led by Cesar Chavez, would begin striking and protesting. Black nationalism would rise. Riots would increase. Unrest was palpable. The economy was worsening, and hippies would start showing up. Hippies are a very odd phenomenon, because the thing we remember them as is a mixture of multiple phenomena. On the one hand, there are wealthy middle and upper class kids who in the plentiful post-war world felt stifled by the conformist world that they found themselves in. Everyone who had just been through the Great Depression and the Second World War really did not want to rock the boat, but they hadn't seen any of that. So they looked around, and they were young and naive, and thought, why don't we just have a lot of sex and drugs? Which is the sort of thing you might think if you were a teenager in a time of ridiculous plenty. At the same time, there were also a number of street kids on the West Coast, and they were typically poor, but they started integrating with these upper and middle class kids who wanted to live as bohemians. There was also a component of older generations. Much of the art and music associated with the culture was created by figures from the silent generation, not from the boomers. There were also academics, figures like Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary, who had begun some time ago, becoming heavily inspired by Eastern philosophies and having discovered psilocybin and LSD. right next to them on the universities were radical leftists. At this point, communism was beginning to become increasingly unpopular, and they realized that they really didn't have a path forward with the working class. A whole new group of leftist thinkers began to emerge. Now, this bit of academic history is really dense and really weird. Going back to the early 20th century, universities, particularly in Germany, began to create departments dedicated to Marxism, similarly to how the Soviets would, treating it as a science. This would particularly take hold in Frankfurt, Germany, where during the Weimar era, the Frankfurt School was born. It would span a couple decades, but its influence longer, with some of its most prominent figures, like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, and Walter Benjamin. They were inspired by Marxism and functionally shared the same goals, but began to develop some of their own theories as well. As time went on, they began to split into different schools of thought. One that emerged was critical theory, which was ultimately a doubling down on the Hegelian dialectic applied to social systems. Critical theorists would become critical of all social structures and narratives. It would often be pointed out that they were critical of Marxism as well. However, they were entirely sympathetic and shared the same goals. They just believed that its current instantiation was insufficient. They began to develop a theory where all of the stories of a society were based entirely on imposed narratives, that what a society's story told and didn't tell was indicative of what its ruling powers wanted the masses to believe. It was effectively a new Marxist power struggle story. All narratives were just an imposition of power. Some began to take a different route, however. Figures like Georgi Lukács would begin to think of some of the critical theorists as time-wasting academics, that they were not sufficiently revolutionary. Debates like this would continue for some time. However, as the Nazi Party came to power, they put a stop to that. But their ideas didn't go away. The post-war era saw substantial philosophical turbulence across Europe. France would become a major center for new ways of thinking. In the 1960s, existentialism had been the dominant philosophy of the academic institutions. It was led by figures like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, who put philosophical focus on the subjective experience of individuals. In a world where many of the social structures and beliefs had decayed, they began to posit that man makes his own meaning. Yet this began to lose favor, being replaced by structuralism, which never really fully formed into its own thing very well. It was ill-defined. Its posit was that structure was the underlying makeup of reality and of human existence, and that experience was merely the mediation of superficialities. Though it would gain some traction, the wild social shifts of the 1960s would quickly create much more novel, radical ideas in the universities. Arising in France, post-structuralists emerged, led by figures like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. They shared many common beliefs with the critical theorists. They believed that meaning was mediated through discourse, that there is no true, fundamental, underlying reality of meaning. And quite like the critical theorists did, as they applied to the politics of the Weimar era, they became critical of narrative, that was the imposition of meaning. This way of thinking would particularly grow in literature departments, holding that the meaning of stories, the meaning of narrative itself, was entirely imposed. Taking those critical theorist Marxist beliefs, they began to make the claim that our idea of meaning, our stories, our very conception of reality was imposed by power, that it was imbalances in power and domination of one over the other that created our narratives and our reality. Figures like Jean-Francois Lyotard would lead this new belief system of postmodernism. This would make its way to the United States. So now, the universities had Marxists looking for a new tactic, postmodernists in the humanities department, anti-war, civil rights, and free speech protests going on all the time. It was the perfect soup to cook up a new political faction. So let's put a new ideology on the board. The new left would emerge with a revamped critical theory as its academic wing. Characterized by a post-Marxism, they believed that the revolution would come from the marginalized groups who the narrative of Western society had sought to denigrate. That the revolution would come from the black ghettos, from homosexuals, from feminists, and from the margins of society. 1967 and 1968 would see a rapid increase in turbulence, anti-war protests, the rise of black nationalists, campus protests. America of the 1960s had lost its stability and tranquility of the prior decade. Martin Luther King would be assassinated that year, under rather suspicious circumstances. It would later be revealed that both the Kennedy administration and the FBI had been working with him and his group, and over the later years of the 1960s had become increasingly concerned about communist and Soviet influence. Robert Kennedy, who had been a senator and served as Attorney General, was running for president. He wanted de-escalation in Vietnam. He hoped to negotiate a resolution, earning him much anti-war support. Much of his campaign focused around the poverty and economic problems that had been emerging, proposing ideas like jobs and investment programs. He was favorable towards the civil rights campaigns, hoping to end the racial conflict that had been accelerating, and, as a former Attorney General, spoke often of the increasing crime, particularly in America's cities. He was seen as another chance for that John F. Kennedy vision. Maybe they could build that world after all. Yet while campaigning, he too would be shot. The man who assassinated him, Sirhan Sirhan, is a really odd figure. He was an Arab Palestinian Christian who by all accounts seems to have been an active, practicing, and mystical Christian. He had at one point trained to be a jockey but suffered a head injury. His motivations aren't entirely clear, and Robert's family seemed very suspicious of the whole situation. Robert had found himself in a high-stakes fight, just like his brother. For a period of time, the Kennedys were quite friendly with organized crime, with very high and quite plausible suspicion that organized crime in Chicago had secured a victory in the 1960 election. There was a curious nexus of power that had formed, with the support of the imperial class and the Anglo-American think tanks that were the intellectual and political driving force behind the new Anglo-American global liberal economic order. Intelligence agencies had become very prominent in both the United States and Britain, but they very often operated through alliances and assets. Back in the Second World War, naval intelligence began to become concerned that German saboteurs might attack some of their maritime assets. Navy intelligence commander Charles Haffenden would approach Joseph Lanza, a New York racketeer who was highly active in the waterfront and well connected to the unions. Navy intelligence and Lanza would reach an agreement. Lanza would begin providing intel on the New York waterfront and use his influence in an attempt to control the unions. As this plan would unfold, the new Intelligence Organized Crime Alliance would approach Meyer Lansky, the extremely powerful Jewish mafia boss who had made an enormous fortune in Prohibition, as well as the Italian boss, Lucky Luciano. The Jewish mafia hated the Germans. They hated how the Nazi government had treated Germany's Jewish population, while the Italians shared a similar grievance against the Mussolini government. So the two mafias and American intelligence all shared one common enemy, the Axis powers, and would begin to work together very closely. It would be Luciano's intelligence that would be of foundational importance to the Allied invasion of Sicily. These were very powerful gangsters with expansive networks. They were able to act as intelligence agencies all their own, and the alliance was powerful. After the war, some of German intelligence would surrender to the Allies. Realizing their usefulness, the American government would bring them on board. Figures like Reinhard Gehlen, a German top spy, would become American assets. They would be sent back to Europe to begin espionage operations against the Soviets. It would be Gehlen's network who would be responsible for over 70% of the information American intelligence gained on the state of the Soviet military during the early years of the Cold War. They would as well go back into Germany, conducting various operations there, intelligence gathering, and political projects designed to steer the new German state in the East and the West. So now you had the Italian mob, the Jewish mob, and former German intelligence, all working with the CIA, who in turn was working with MI6. The Kennedys had been quite friendly with this nexus of players, but they would begin moving against them. Robert Kennedy, making serious efforts at bringing down organized crime, and both brothers antagonistic in attempting to reduce the power of the CIA. So hey, they just happened to both die. But still, these probably aren't the guys you want as your enemies. The national mood would worsen as a result of these assassinations. The movement of hippies was originally naive and youthful. They listened to folk and psychedelic rock music. They were young people who, like young people, enjoyed sex and drugs. They were frivolous and indulgent, but in a way that's the world they were born into. They were the children of prosperity. They believed that society needed to expand its mind, that people should begin living new ways. They started creating communes and dropping out, hoping to create a world of peace and love. But by 1968, things had turned much more sinister. These indulgent middle-class kids were quickly overtaken by true street kids, dropouts, and criminals. And not the we're smoking a joint and dropping acid criminals, more like the people getting shot criminals. The drug market had rapidly expanded. Hippie drug consumption had been supported by cannabis farmers, relatively small smuggling operations from places like Afghanistan, and hippie chemists like the Brotherhood of Eternal Love and the Grateful Dead family. Yet, as the 60s neared their end, the drug market expanded rapidly. Now much more aggressive organized crime would get involved. Middle Eastern smuggling routes would begin to become larger and larger operations as the heroin market would expand. At the same time, larger amphetamine markets would begin to emerge, particularly making use of biker gangs like the Hells Angels in order to facilitate smuggling. Things would get much more violent in places like the streets of San Francisco. The innocence was gone. This divide could clearly be seen on display in the 1968 Democratic National Convention. There, you had the flowery, goofy, and naive upper-class hippies sitting around chanting with their prayer beads, and at the same time, much more serious radicals like the Hippies. The Hippies are an odd group, and symbolic of the early stages of the New Left. They called themselves Yippies as an acronym for the Youth International Party. They were made up of hippies, as well as New Left radicals. They thought of themselves as the radicalized hippies. They were a sort of anarchic leftist group. Early on, they began with what were largely trolling campaigns. They would do things like threaten to levitate the Pentagon, more just trying to get a laugh while making their point. However, by the time the 1968 Democratic Convention took place in Chicago, they would plan a multi-day protest festival. This protest festival would lead to violence. Police and protest groups, particularly anti-war activists, would end up in a widely televised and shocking clash. The Democratic Party looked weak and lawless, like they weren't able to even control one city. People looked around at what the United States had become. They remembered just a few years earlier the optimism, the growth, the prosperity, the stability, and they saw this: racial conflict, an ongoing war with no end in sight, economic deterioration, crime growing rampant, and young people being freaks. America had had enough, and thus, that year, Richard Nixon would become president. The following year, Nixon would begin withdrawing troops from Vietnam, while shifting to a very odd tactic of bombing in Laos and Cambodia. That same year, in response to high inflation, the Federal Reserve would begin tightening monetary policy, as the United States would begin moving into the malaise years. But there was also renewed optimism. Neil Armstrong would be the first man to walk on the moon, rejuvenating that sense that America could accomplish great things. Woodstock would be a major cultural moment, as the hippie movement transitioned into becoming something much more accessible to middle-class kids around the country. It was really beginning to not be a movement anymore, and more of just an aesthetic. It was music and fashion more than anything. Though there was heated disagreement in these years, largely it was a victory lap for liberals. There was a rejuvenation of leftists in the Marxist vein, and they would become increasingly radical in the 1970s, with groups like the Weather Underground. But the 60s really demonstrated a clear and categoric defeat of America's right. Segregationists were squished, and their views made practically illegal. There would be some radical right groups, like George Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party, although much of the further right thought that that was a non-serious group and just made them look bad with ridiculous theatrics. Either way, regardless of how serious the different groups were, none of them gained any traction. The liberal order had enforced itself, and entrenched itself deeply. People who opposed the new institutions and order found themselves mysteriously dead, being shot by a lone gunman with no ascertainable motive. So that's just the serendipity of bad luck for you there. The Second World War really was the instantiation and solidification of the Anglo-American global project. It was where the foundation mythos, that origin point for the order, came from. But the 60s would function in a similar way, particularly for the boomer generation. The civil rights movement acted as its own foundation story, and was where a vast amount of today's social laws come from. If the Second World War was the origin of the economic and political system, then perhaps the 60s was the origin of the social system. The colorfulness, the youthfulness, and the fervor of the 1960s would eventually fade, but the following decades would be profoundly shaped by the changes of those years. If anyone still had any doubts after the Suez Crisis that Britain's physical empire was falling apart, 1960 would put that to rest. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan would give his Winds of Change speech. It would be in more poetic and political terms, but ultimately he was spelling out that the empire was going to disappear. It became clear to everyone that the colonial holdings of Britain were all bound for independence. There were enough economic problems at home. There was absolutely no way to afford this anymore. People have often imagined that the British Empire must have been enormously profitable, while the imperial system was, but the colonies most certainly were not. Britain's colonial holdings accounted for a very small, single-digit proportion of their national income, and required an absolutely enormous expense to maintain. And even if Britain could somehow find the money, independence sentiment was growing far too strong to resist. That year, the United Kingdom would see a GDP growth rate of 6.3%. The economy was beginning to get back in shape. Britain had largely fallen behind the United States in cultural relevance. Much of Britain's music, art, fashion, and film were either coming from Europe or from the United States. However, 1962 would begin to see that change. 1962 would see the release of the Beatles' Love Me Do, with the band going on to be, well, the Beatles. British musical acts would begin to become huge in the United States, and it really is worth pointing out that them being from a northern city is quite remarkable. The United Kingdom would always put its southern culture out to the world, but now a group of northerners were dominating. Harold Macmillan would resign in 1963, with Alec Douglas Home becoming Prime Minister in his place. The following year, Harold Wilson's Labour would win a narrow majority. Their economic growth remained solid, yet their balance of payment shortfall was not getting much better. Wilson would introduce a 15% import surcharge in an attempt to address this. The same year, the country would introduce the comprehensive education system, creating the modern state school system. Upon the death of Winston Churchill, he was given a well-attended state funeral in 1965, being transported to St. Paul's. This is another really symbolic death. Although it isn't like the changing of a monarch, Winston Churchill had become a powerful symbolic figure of the wartime era, and definitional to the post-war sense of self. His death, whether in reality or only in symbolism, marked the changing of an era. That November, the Race Relations Act of 1965 would be passed, making racial discrimination in public and incitement to hate criminal offenses. This was really foundational to a new British effort to attempt to stamp out racial prejudices by law. Though it would change some behaviors, it would most certainly not eliminate prejudices. Wilson would call for a snap election the next year, where he would greatly expand Labour's majority. That same year, as the balance of payments deficit had not improved, the government would issue a freeze on wages and prices. 1967 would be another major year for social changes in law. The Sexual Offences Act would decriminalize homosexuality for those over 21 years old, and the Abortion Act would legalize abortion in some strictly defined cases. That same year, the pound would be devalued by 14.3%, and the Bank of England would raise interest rates to 8%. American culture had really seeped into Britain, and that whole hippie youth culture was becoming enormous. That year, Great Britain would have many of its own responses to the Summer of Love. There had been a constant exchange between the two nations. Certainly bands like the Beatles were enormous, but the folk revival of that era would be enormously influenced by the folk revival happening in England and Scotland, particularly Donovan, the singer and songwriter from Scotland, and the Incredible String Band, as well from Scotland. Bands like the Moody Blues from Birmingham, or Pink Floyd from London, all fed off each other and created this Anglo-American musical cultural phenomenon. In 1968, Parliament would pass yet another major bit of legislation, the British state had ostensibly decided to allow peoples from around the former British colonies to come to the United Kingdom. Now, this wasn't a straightforward decision, and did experience many periods of specifically banning people from former British colonies entering. But over the last few decades, immigration was really beginning to increase, and this was really changing how people felt in Britain, particularly after the arrival of the Windrush in 1948, a ship carrying primarily Jamaicans to Britain. The Race Relations Act would be passed in 1968, banning discrimination in employment, housing, and the provisioning of goods and services. That same year, Enoch Powell would give his famous Rivers of Blood speech, warning of the consequences of these waves of immigration. The situation was tense, and there was fervent disagreement. Much like in the United States and on the continent, student protests began. Tensions began running higher, although it was milder. The voting age would be reduced to 18 years old the following year, and the troubles of Northern Ireland would become impossible to ignore. It was clear that massive social changes and internal tensions were beginning to hit Great Britain. Also, a very subtle change is that there was a change in accents. Many of Britain's upper and upper middle class who had been educated in traditional received pronunciation would begin dropping it, preferring to speak in a new, more modern Southern English accent, or in some cases, partially mimicking lower class accents. The idea of appearing to be too upper middle class or too aristocratic had become unpopular, something that those classes would want to distance themselves from, at least amongst the youth. So there's a real clear demarcation of the RP accent going away in this decade.
Well, it is better to sound poor.
Yet, that same year, Britain's balance of payments would hit a surplus, so they did manage it. There would also be a Greek banker by the name of Minos Zombonakos, who was attempting to syndicate an enormous loan for the Shah of Iran, but he had the problem of not being able to have a reference rate. He wanted some measurable interest rate benchmark in order to build this syndicated loan off of. So he, in a consortium of bankers, would come up with a new floating rate benchmark. This isn't too big of a deal now, but this is about to become something very significant. All in all, Britain's 1960s mirrored the United States in many ways, although its taxes were absolutely wild and their economy was worse. It as well was a time of change, and a time of inward-looking cultural reflection, a time where a new culture would be created and imposed. It was the swinging 60s, and it was the far-out 60s. But for some, well, they missed the village green, the church, the clock, and the steeple. The complete and utter destruction that Europe experienced, as well as the social upheaval, led to schools of thought emerging that came to two conclusions. One, that European societies should be strictly controlled. Just freeze everything as it is. The level of industrial growth in the prior century had caused so much chaos, they thought. The revolutions of the 19th century, as well as two unfathomably destructive wars. Just keep society frozen as it is, and when people are inevitably upset by this, create a welfare state to keep them comfortable, satiated, and stagnant in a strong regulatory state. The other was that Europe should integrate its economies. European nations began creating treaties designed to integrate their economies. In 1957, France, West Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium? I don't know what that's supposed to be. Would come together and create the European Economic Community. Its goal was simple: begin integrating the economies of Europe. And though this wouldn't happen immediately, there were many who were hoping that this would lead to a Europe where countries would begin integrating their institutions as well. In 1960, the European Free Trade Association would be created by countries who were not a part of the EEC. That same year, Belgium would leave the Congo, and France would give up many of its West African colonies. It was a time of growing consumerism and of the decline of empires. There would be an economic boom the next year. Meanwhile, on the other side of Europe, Germans in Soviet-controlled East Berlin would decide things look a lot better over on the West, so the Soviets would build the Berlin Wall to make sure they didn't leave. as a testament to just how good their system was. During the war, Germany had lost a lot of guys, so in 1961, they created a guest worker program, which particularly took workers from Turkey, a country with whom the West Germans had an agreement. This was really the beginning of something that Germany would do for decades to come. Oh no, the GDP in this town! Bring in the cheapen Arbeiten! They will build our stuff! And many people were unhappy about that. But a new economic policy was born. After fighting a brutal war, the next year Algeria would gain independence from France as well. It looks like the French Empire was not long for this world either. Trade would grow rapidly in the EEC over the following years. In 1962, the Common Agricultural Policy was adopted, further integrating yet another industry into the system, and something particularly of import for Catholics. The Vatican II Council would begin in 1962, forever changing the fundamental nature of what the Catholic Church is. The following year, in 1963, the Élysée Treaty would be signed between France and West Germany. This pact right here would really form the core of European economic integration, and in many ways is the backbone of the EU of today. The UK would apply to join the EEC, but French President Charles de Gaulle would veto it, saying that the UK was too close to the United States, and therefore could never truly be integrated into the European system. Keep this in mind. This might pop up at some point. Up to this point, we've really seen Anglo-America as the dominant internationalist faction. However, there were economic actors in Europe who still remained enormously powerful. Many powerful financial institutions, and a whole lot of century-old, enormous money. They never ceased being players in the global financial system, and their empires did still exist, although deteriorating rapidly. This European project was in many ways the beginning of a new rival internationalist faction. The City of London, Lord Milner Round Table, Chatham House, Anglo-American nexus of British liberalism, and the French, Dutch, German, continental system, which would one day grow into the EU institutions of today. That same year, the EEC would sign major trade agreements with 18 former colonies in Africa. Something really quite remarkable, as this shows the EEC acting as one economic entity. The economy of Europe was quite good for the following years, and that common market was in full force. However, cultural shifts were hitting Europe as well. American and British culture were making it over to the continent, and were enormously influential, and they were facing social upheaval as well. Student activism began to rise rapidly, and religion rapidly declined. In 1965, the merger treaty would be signed in Brussels, unifying the executive bodies of the European Coal and Steel Community, the EEC, and Euratom, the Atomic Council of Europe, into one unified entity. This integration project had been going very well. However, Charles de Gaulle would begin to become quite skeptical of this. He would refuse to attend EEC meetings for several months following this integration. He believed that he was witnessing the erosion of French sovereignty, which is true, and as a truly enormous player, his absence sent shockwaves. The next year, likely with internationalist concerns on his mind, Charles de Gaulle would withdraw France from NATO's integrated military command and demand that US troops leave France. All the while, the guest worker program is becoming increasingly visible, beginning to create social strain, as much of the German population was very unhappy with the mass influx. As the merger treaty would take effect the next year, the UK would once again apply to join the EEC. And again, de Gaulle would veto it.
Non, tu es American. You are not European. Bah, simply awful.
1968 would see France do France. There would be an enormous wave of student protests, protesting society. And this would begin to spread to workers. Thus, strikes began. The government nearly collapsed. Why? This is just what France does. Everyone's just been trying to scratch that itch that the Fronde left them. And as Europe watched on in horror, as the Soviets put down a mass protest movement in Czechoslovakia, it became clear that defending communism was no longer tenable. That intellectual movement would have to go underground. The EEC would implement a customs union, eliminating internal customs and creating a common external tariff. The year was marked by unrest, protest, riots, strikes, social disintegration, and in 1969, Charles de Gaulle would resign as France's president, wondering what to do, where the European project would go in the absence of de Gaulle. European leaders would meet for the Hague Summit, where they decided for further European integration, that they would keep going forward with the project. In fact, if anything, with de Gaulle gone, they had only lost a powerful sovereigntist voice. The One Big Europe project was in full force.